We've been working our way through the book of 1 Corinthians, I think since September. Does that sound right? None of us even know how long. It has been that long. When we first started, this room was lit by candlelight. Since we've added air conditioning and electricity. And so we find ourselves in 1 Corinthians 13 as the next chapter. We haven't covered this section yet, and it's been a couple of weeks since I've been here. I wanted to, first of all, thank Calvin Malcor, Pastor Calvin Malcor, for sharing with this church 2 weeks ago a reminder of the faith, specifically the faith of Joseph, and having his bones buried in the Promised Land, despite that all he saw was Egypt, and his encouragement and challenge to our faith. And then last week for Rod sharing with us on Easter Sunday the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And I appreciate Rod Bodmer and his sharing, not only on Sunday morning, but stepping in on Friday night as well to minister to the people of this church. And this morning he finds himself in Klamath Falls at Mountain Lakes Bible Camp, preaching at a men's retreat there. So very high demand speaker. He just is all over the place. So I appreciate Rod and his ministry to this church last week. And this week we're continuing our study of 1 Corinthians in chapter 13. Has anybody ever heard this passage before? I didn't know if we're plowing new ground. Yeah, if you've been to a wedding in the last 20 years, you've heard this chapter, and this chapter on love, and it's teaching on the love of God. And I'm hoping this morning as we take a look at it, we can challenge our hearts to understand what God's Word teaches us. Now, I want us to think about something. The search for love in our day has become a theme that is it's a refrain that's repeated over and over. The search for love. People are searching for love. We hear it in advertising. If you just buy the right kind of toothpaste or body spray or soap, people will chase after you in the grocery store, seeking your presence. In movies, in television shows, the plot line that is visited over and over again is a character searching for meaning. And that meaning is often found in discovering someone that they can love. And I think what's interesting about the search for love being such a prominent theme in our culture is the fact that defining exactly what we're searching for is becoming increasingly difficult. So while more and more people want to find love and are searching for love, I think it's more and more difficult to pin down exactly what it is we're looking for when it comes to love. Is it a feeling? Is love a feeling? Is it a passion? Is it an embrace? Is love growing old together? Is it dutiful responsibility in relationship? Is it carefree adventure? And my guess is that many of us today would respond, well, of course, it's all of those things, and yet also it's none of those things, and isn't that wonderful? You can't define love. You just know it when you find it. One of the reasons it's difficult to define love in simple terms is because we have so many different experiences with love. In fact, one reason it's difficult to define love is a lot of us have different experiences with love that we're difficult, we're failures, we're challenges. We have our own failures of love in our life. We have failures of love that we've observed in people around us. Say, for example, you grew up in a home where your parents' love was duty and responsibility, and yet in your observations you saw no discernible joy or happiness. So you may in your own heart say, well, when I have a home of my own, my love will not be duty and responsibility. It will be carefree love, full of joy. But perhaps you've seen love and observed love that is carefree and adventurous and whimsical, and yet the instability of it was so nerve-wracking that you said to yourself, when I have love in my life, it's going to have responsibility and duty, and it will be stable and strong. See, the failures that we've observed in our own life and in others informs what we're looking for in love, and so love becomes very, very difficult to define. And I think that's why this passage is so popular at weddings, because love all of a sudden is comprehensively defined to some degree. We imagine that a marriage defined by the love in this chapter will both be strong and yet also romantic, right? This passage talks of kindness, patience, truth, endurance, strength. It talks of hope. While at the same time, this passage tells us to cast aside irritability, resentfulness, stubbornness, arrogance, and rudeness. This has it all. It has strength, and yet it also has tenderness. It has duty, and yet it also has passion. I mean, it's all right here, the plot for the next great Christian romance novel. I mean, this is the love we're all looking for, isn't it? Well, I think if we say it out loud like that, it seems like it doesn't fit. There's something doesn't feel right about us saying this is exactly what that is. There are a number of reasons why this doesn't seem right. First of all, the fact is we've all experienced love differently in our own experience. Some of you would read this passage and say, despite the fact that it is a beautifully written passage, many have said this is Paul's greatest work, is chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians, his single greatest section of Scripture that his hand wrote. But at the same time, you might say, well, this doesn't do love justice. Certainly doesn't do love justice. Love is the sun rising over a meadow. Love is a baby's touch. Love is a dog's wet nose, maybe for you. I don't know. Love is patient, love is kind seems to you like a sort of robotic recitation of love. Love is patient, love is kind. Well, come on, that's not emotive. But others of you feel like 1 Corinthians 13 is way too poetic for your taste. Love is 5 10-hour shifts a week, overtime pay on holidays, 3 square meals a day for your family, and maybe a vacation at the lake in the summer. Love is being there for the people in your life, and when trouble hits, you don't need a meadow. You don't need a dog's wet nose, I guess. They need people they can count on. And that's what love is, being there, and we don't need all this poetry of business. Now, another reason why this chapter doesn't always set well in terms of trying to find love and define love is another reason. Well, let me do it this way. How many of us have 1 Corinthians 13 read at your wedding or have been to a wedding where it was read? Let's raise our hands. Okay? Okay, we're good. Okay, put your hands down. How many of us were able to pull off 1 Corinthians 13 as you prepared for church this morning? Yeah, no irritability, right? No rudeness. I mean, we read this chapter and say, man, this is great if marriage was like this. But the fact is, there is irritability in love. There is rudeness that we experience. What we read here doesn't always marry up with the experience of love in our own life, even as Christians. We read it as weddings because we want it in our lives, but the ink isn't dry on our marriage certificates when we realize and wonder if it's possible. Can we really do love the way 1 Corinthians 13 is written? Now, the Apostle Paul, 1 Corinthians 13 is not a fairy tale dream. This is not a pretend, we hope to be sort of like this deal. This is not some idealized version of reality we're going to strive for but never attain. It's not what this is. And it should come as no surprise to us that Paul will tell us that the most excellent way in the body of Christ is love, as he describes here. And we can't understand Paul's definition and his description of love based on our own notions and our own experience. So when you read this, we can't read our own experiences of love into it. We can't read into it our failures, our past experiences. We can't look at this and say it doesn't work because it doesn't work in my life. We have to understand and appreciate Paul's notion of what love is based on the fact that this is exactly the kind of love that Jesus has given us. And this is exactly the kind of love that Jesus demonstrated and wants to see borne out in our lives. And what I want us to do is understand this love, this most excellent way, and see if we can understand it in a way that makes sense, that doesn't put it in the realm of fairy tale, but puts it in the realm of how can we live more like Christ in the love that he showed to us. So the title of the message this morning, I stole right out of the Bible. It's called The Most Excellent Way. And I want to look at love, the most excellent way in the body of Christ, and especially as we consider the work of Jesus in his ministry here and his ministry on the cross. There's a couple of passages we're going to have to turn to besides just 1 Corinthians 13. The first one is Mark. Mark chapter 12, verse 28. And you can turn there with me if you want, or you can just listen as I read along. Mark 12, beginning at verse 28. One of the teachers of the law came and they heard Jesus debating with the Pharisees, and he came and asked Jesus this question. You've heard this before. Of all the commandments, which is the most important? Of all the commandments, which is the most important? This was Jesus' response, quoting from the book of Deuteronomy. The most important one, answered Jesus, is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. So when Jesus was asked, what is the most important commandment that God has given us? He says this, love God, love your neighbor. Love God and love your neighbor. In Luke 10, he gave a similar response to a question. A teacher asked him, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus said, well, what do you read in the law? And the teacher of the law answered, well, the law tells us to love God and to love our neighbor. And Jesus said, good answer. Why don't you go and do that? And the teacher of the law said, well, who's my neighbor? And he tells the story that you're very familiar with. It's of the Good Samaritan. And he says, this is how you love your neighbor. Is you've got somebody who has been robbed, who has been beaten, who's been left for dead. And the Good Samaritan, expecting no return of his own, provides help, provides aid to a man who is dying. He tends to his wounds, puts him in a hotel, pays for his meal, pays for his medical treatment. And Jesus says, this is what a neighbor does. He offers love to someone who has no ability to make any return on that investment of love. He looks, he sees somebody, he is moved with compassion. The Bible tells us the Good Samaritan had pity on the one who was beaten and robbed. He is moved with compassion, and then he acts. He makes decisions saying, I love this individual that I don't know, but I'm moved with compassion. I will show love to this individual by meeting their need. I'm going to show love to them because I'm moved to love them. And I say, so love really in Jesus' words is this, a movement of the heart that results in action. So it's not just simply doing something, it's also a heart condition where I say, I see something in somebody and it moves me. I have compassion and care for the situation of that person, and I want to show love in that situation. I'm going to do something. So I don't just walk up to him and give him a hug. The guy who had been beaten and robbed, a hug maybe would have been nice, but it might have been painful. What he needed was medical care. And so that he was moved in his love to action. Now, why is this important? You're saying, well, Greg, this is great. We know all this. We learned this in Sunday school when we were in first grade or second grade. Let me point something out to you from the book of 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 3. We've already studied it, and I know you've committed the book to memory as a part of our study. No? Okay, that's fine. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul is saying this. 1 Corinthians 3, verse 11. He says, no one can lay any foundation other than one that has been laid, which is Jesus Christ. If any man builds on this foundation using gold, silver, costly stones, wood, hay, or straw, his work will be shown for what it is. Because the day will bring it to light. It will be revealed with fire. The fire will test the quality of each man's work. If what he has built survives, he will receive reward. If it is burned, he will suffer loss. Then over in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, he tells us how the judgment is made. It says this in 1 Corinthians 4, verse 5. Therefore, judge nothing before the appointed time. Wait till the Lord comes. He will bring to light what is hidden in darkness. And listen to this. This is the important part here. He will expose the motives of men's hearts. He will expose the motives of men's heart. At that time, each will receive his praise from God. God will not just look at what we have done. He will look at our heart and say, why have we done what we have done? And you say, well, how do we know what the motive ought to be? What are the two greatest commands? You can go ahead and say it. What are the two greatest commands? Love God, love your neighbor as yourself. What is the motive of my heart as I seek to serve God and others? Do I do it out of an expression of love for God? Do I do it out of an expression of love for others as I love myself? Then our motive is going to be in the right place. Our motive is going to be in the right place. We're going to be judged by Christ, looking at our heart, and the question is to be, do we love? So the reason I say this is the question about love and what love is and how it functions in our heart and in the community of believers is extraordinarily important. Because absent love in our heart, we completely miss the boat on what God is doing. Absent love for God and for our fellow Christians and for the people in our communities, we have completely missed what God is doing. And that's why this chapter, 1 Corinthians 13, is so critical. It's right in the middle of Paul talking about the Corinthian believers using their spiritual gifts to serve one another. And he wants them to understand that it's got to be about love for God and others. And if we miss this important understanding of God's love in our own heart for others, we miss the opportunity to properly serve God according to the way he would. So listen, the most excellent way, verses 1 through 3. Here's the header for verses 1 through 3 if you'd like to take notes. I want to tell you the shocking truth of verses 1 through 3. Here it is. The shocking truth, not all good works are profitable. Not all good works are profitable. If I speak in the tongues of men and angels, but have not love, I am a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. And that's not a good thing. Some of you say, hey, that sounds great. We love the cymbals. Bring it on. No, that's a bad thing. It means we're trying to speak with meaning. He's talking about someone communicating meaning, and he's saying you're not communicating anything. You're just a noisemaker. The shocking truth is without love, we can do good things, and they are not profitable at all. Not profitable to God's kingdom, not profitable to our own growth, not profitable to the growth of others. If I speak in the tongues of men and angels and have not love, I am a resounding gong, a clanging cymbal. What's incredible about the Corinthian church is they were a fantastic, amazing, powerful church. There were miracles going on. There were people getting saved. They were meeting needs. They were affluent. They had everything. If they were going to do a conference on how to do church, everybody would show up. And Paul is saying, you're hitting it out of the park, and it may be that it is a complete waste of time. He's saying without love, it doesn't matter how good you are doing church, it's a waste of time. It's not accomplishing anything. And he addresses specifically their concern over speaking in tongues. They were very excited about the fact that many of the people in their church had a gift of speaking in other languages, and people could understand them. And this is pretty amazing stuff. And he is saying, if you're doing that with no love, why not just close your mouth? That would be better. It would be better just to not say anything than to continue sharing and preaching and communicating without love. If I have the gift of prophecy, if I can fathom all mysteries and knowledge, and if I have faith that can move mountains but don't have love, he says this, I am nothing. So what if we had somebody in our church who had the ability to heal sick people? There's a number of people in there. It's like, sign us up. We'll take one of those, right? We will take one of those. Paul is saying it would be better if the sick people stayed sick if that person didn't use their gift out of love. He says that is where the meaning is. It's in the act of love that service matters. That's where it comes from our heart. Do we love God? Do we serve and minister and follow the Lord out of a love for Him? Do we meet the needs of others and seek to know and minister to others out of love for them? If not, he is saying, waste of time, waste of energy, waste of resources. He says this, he said, if I give all I possess to the poor and surrender my body to the flames, but have not love, I gain nothing. He's saying that there are many folks in the Corinthian church that were big donors. Because there were some very wealthy people in that church. He's saying if you were giving of your resources, and it was out of an act of obligation and not out of an act of love for God and others, it was a waste of money. You would have done better to keep it rather than to give it without love. All of these things, spiritual gifts, miracles, people getting saved, church happening, powerful things happening. All of these things, you say, you don't have love? It's not worth the time and effort. This is what love is, the foundation of what the Christian is to do. The marker of growth in a church, the marker of growth in the Christian life is love. Do we love God? Do we love others? This is the part, when you read this chapter, now, my understanding, most weddings I've been to, that we don't read this part, right? We skip down, we start with verse 4, love is patient, love is kind. Why is that? Because these three little verses, if you're reading them the way I'm understanding them, it kind of makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up a little bit of a cold sweat. Anybody in their own mind doing what I'm doing, have I wasted some time in my life? How much have I wasted because I haven't had God's love? It's just I'm doing things out of duty, but it has nothing to do with loving God or loving others. If we've done stuff, if we've done work in the church, outside the church, in the lives of the people around us, and it wasn't motivated, it didn't come from a place of love, Paul is saying here, fairly straightforward, without mincing a lot of words, it profited nothing. It profited nothing. The shocking truth is, not all good works are possible. You all probably found we were going through 1 Corinthians 13 this morning. You were pretty pumped. You're like, all right, it's going to be real positive. Yeah, thanks, Greg. Hey, I didn't write it, okay? Just so you know, I didn't write this thing. First section, the shocking truth, not all good works are profitable. Second, verses 4 through 7, the impossible task, love as Christ loves. The impossible task, love as Christ loved. Look at it. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It is not rude. What is missing from this thing? The qualifiers. Love is patient unless you know so-and-so. I mean, there's a certain point where patience breaks down, right? What's interesting here is there's no qualification to this thing. It's just love is patient. Well, you don't understand, Greg. I have some pretty rude people in my life. And what's interesting is it doesn't change for you. It just says love is patient. And when we read this, there's no qualification. There's no extenuating circumstances. There's no exit strategy where all of a sudden it doesn't apply. Love is patient. Love is kind. It doesn't envy. It doesn't boast. That's just the nature of love is in any and all circumstances and situations and people. Now, maybe it's just me. Is anybody else in the room with me that there are some people that it is easier to do with than others? Is that right? Yeah, okay. I mean, it's the nature of life. With some people, it's easy to offer patience. Others, they know where your last nerve is, and when they meet you, it's their job to stand on it. You know, you're all thinking of somebody in particular. Is it Daryl? Oh, no. I'm kidding, Daryl. Only half the people were thinking. Love is, regardless of who, regardless of what, regardless of anything, love is patient. Love is kind. 1 John 4:19. We love because, you know the verse? Christ first loved us. We love because Christ first loved us. Romans 5:8. Of course, you've got that in memory. Romans 5:8. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Matthew 18, I want to take a look at it. Matthew 18, verse 21, passage you're familiar with. Peter came to Jesus and he said, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother when he sins against me? Up to 7 times? And he says it kind of with his pinky in his, up to 7 times, because I'm awesome. That's what he was inferring there. Peter, Mr. Awesome, would forgive up to 7 times. And Jesus said, hey, lame-o, how about 70 times? And then he tells the story. There was this king, and he wanted to settle accounts with his servants. And he brought this one servant in front of him, and he owed him $1 billion. He owed him $1 billion. We'll just say that. And the servant threw himself on the ground. He said, listen, I can't pay the $1 billion. He wasn't able to pay it. So the master did what any reasonable person would do. He ordered that he and his wife and children, all he had, be sold and to repay the debt. So he owes $1 billion. He's going to sell his whole family, probably get 50 G's out of it, and this family will divide it up into slavery. And the servant fell on his knees and begged and begged and begged, please forgive me. And the master did an amazing thing. He forgave a debt of $1 billion. Then the servant goes out, and he meets up with a guy that he had given a $5 McDonald's gift certificate to the week before, and he wanted it back. And the guy had dropped it. He couldn't find his $5 McDonald's gift certificate. And $5 doesn't go as far at McDonald's as it used to. And he knew this. He was peeved. He was not going to be able to get a combo. And he says, he grabbed him. He began to choke him. Pay back my McDonald's gift certificate. His fellow servant said, be patient. I'll pay it back. I'll find it. I'll go get one. He said, take off. He refused. I'm going to throw you in prison until you can pay it back, which makes no sense. There are no gift certificates in prison. We all know this. The master heard of this. And he called the servant before him. He said, what are you doing? You wicked servant. I canceled your entire debt because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant? And in anger, his master turned him over to the jailers to be tortured until he could pay back his $1 billion. I don't know what torture pays, but it's going to take a long time for that torture to equal $1 billion. Why do we tell this story? Because the point is, you will forgive if you've been forgiven. If you haven't been forgiven or don't understand the degree to which you've been forgiven, it's hard to forgive. So how do we say, well, love is patient, love is kind? How can we do that when people are difficult and make us impatient and make us unkind? We understand that we were the one that could have irritated Christ, could have bothered Christ, could have made him impatient or him unkind while we were still sinners, but he didn't respond that way. He died on the cross. He said, I'll take it. I'll take your flaws, your problems, your sin, your mess-ups, your rebellion, your obstinance. I'll take it, and I'll love you. And the parable Jesus tells us is to remind us the diagnostic in our heart is when we cannot offer love to people because they irritate us, we realize very quickly, just like that, I don't understand how much I've been forgiven. That's just all that is supposed to do to us. If I understood how much I have been forgiven through Christ, this wouldn't bother me as much as it does. And it's normal. We all do it. But that's the response Jesus is calling us for. Love is patient, love is kind. Well, what does it mean when I'm impatient? It means I have not really gotten my head around how much I've been forgiven. Because if I figured out how much I could cause impatience on Christ's behalf, but I don't, I would be a lot more easy on those who cause me impatience. In Luke chapter 7, Jesus was having dinner at a guy's house, and the Pharisee said this to himself. He said this, Jesus, let me just start here. Verse 40, Jesus answered him, Simon, I have something to tell you. Simon is a Pharisee, and Simon says, yeah, go for it. 2 men owed a certain guy money. One owed him 500, the other 50. Just so you know, keep up with me, 500 is more than 50. Good? All right. Neither of them had the money to pay them back. He canceled the debt of both men. One who owed 500, one who owed 50. Which would love him more? And Simon replied, the one who canceled had the bigger debt canceled. He would love him more. And Jesus said, you are wise. And now he responds to Simon because during this whole dinner party, a woman has been washing Jesus' feet with her hair and tears and perfume. And he says this to him. Jesus says this to Simon, do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me water for my feet. And yet she has not stopped wetting my feet with her tears. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman from the time I have entered has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, for she has loved much. She has experienced a great debt being removed, and that forgiveness has moved her to love. When you read the Bible, when you read the stories of the Bible, who do you identify with? Think about it. When you read Cain and Abel, you say, well, I hope that I never get so angry at my brother that I kill him. Well, what we're supposed to understand is we're like Cain in that we want to seek God on our own terms. When you read about Israel in the wilderness, what's the lesson you take out of that? Who do you identify? I need to be like Moses, a man of faith? No, that story's in there to remind us we're just like Israel. We gripe and we complain and we get disappointed with what God's doing. If we had our way, we'd go back to Egypt where there are pots of meat. When you read David and Goliath, who do you identify with there? Do you want to be like David and slay your giants? No, that story is there to tell us we're Israel hiding in our tents. And we need somebody to come slay our giant sin, and that is Christ. When you read the book of Esther, who do you identify with? Esther, who faithfully served God? No, in that story, you and I are Haman, who, if we had our way, we would destroy the things of God. When Jesus stood before Pilate, who are we? We are the crowd screaming out, crucify him. We are the crowd screaming out, crucify him. While we were sinners, Christ died for us. This is how we discover the love of God. This is how we're able to offer love to others, because Jesus is patient. Jesus is kind. Jesus does not envy. Jesus does not boast. Jesus is not proud. Jesus is not rude. Jesus is not self-seeking. Jesus is not easily angered. Jesus keeps no record of wrongs. Jesus does not delight in evil, but he rejoices in the truth. He always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. That's the love of Christ. When we discover how much we've been forgiven, we discover what it means to love Christ. As long as we are fixated on the fact that we're not that bad, it will always be difficult to love. Because we will only love to the degree that we needed Jesus. He who has been forgiven much will love much. This love that is in 1 Corinthians 13, this great marriage chapter, if we want to call it that, it is absolutely impossible to accomplish except for sinners who have discovered the love of Christ. It is absolutely impossible for any of us to accomplish the love described in this chapter except by sinners who have discovered the love of Christ in their sin. In the midst of their sin, in faith, trusting in the love of Christ and receiving forgiveness of sin, in that moment when we understand how much we've been forgiven, we can extend that same love to others. We can extend that same patience to others. Sinners, resting in God's love, will love other sinners profoundly. Sinners, resting in God's love, will love other sinners profoundly. Folks who have no sin or need of Christ will always have difficulty loving people who sin, and that's everybody. So the fix here is not for you to gin up love. Okay, the fix here is to discover how much you need Christ. Yeah, as a Christian, we're not home yet. We're not perfect yet. And as long as we can come to that significant and great dependence on the love of Christ, we will understand the weight of which our salvation cost him, and we will seek to offer that love to others. Okay, verses 1 through 3, the shocking truth is not all good works are profitable. Some of us, many of us, all of us have wasted our time and resources by doing good works without love. Secondly, the impossible task that we're told in this chapter is to love the way Christ loved. And finally, in verses 8 through 13, Paul wants us to live for the future because love never fails. So listen to this. Love never fails, he says in verse 8. Where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the imperfect disappears. So I'm going to summarize this. I'm going to sum this up in a fairly brief statement. Here's what Paul is saying. We're going to heaven someday, and we're not there yet. Okay, good? Are you with me? All right, good. We're going to heaven someday, and we're not there yet. And he uses three analogies to say we're not there yet. He says there's imperfect, which is now, and one day we will go to the perfect. He says, so we're not there yet. We're still in the imperfect. Another analogy he uses, he says, when I was a child, I acted like a child. When I'm a man, I act like a man. He's saying this life, here and now, is when we're like children. We don't know everything. We haven't learned everything. There will be a day in heaven where we will operate as grown-ups. And then finally, his last analogy is right now we look at the Lord and his things as though we're looking in a mirror. One day we will look and see him face to face. And he says, so during this time where we're in the imperfect, where we're like children, and where we don't see things clearly, what do we have? We have prophecy, we have speaking in tongues, we have knowledge, we have the scripture. He says we have all of these things. Now one day, though, we're going to move from the imperfect to being in God's presence. What will we have there? Well, we won't have a need for knowledge. Why? Because we're going to know everything. There's not going to be classes in heaven. There will be no need for teachers. If a class was called, we would start teaching. Everybody say, we already know all this. Why are we doing this? There's no need for communicating the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ in various languages in heaven because we're going to know it already. There's no need for additional knowledge. There's no need for prophecy because everything is fulfilled. But what is the one thing that will continue on in heaven when all these other gifts have passed away? You've read it. Love. The one thing here, he says, listen, we do all these amazing things, but when it comes to our eternity, the one thing we're going to take with us is love. But we get it all backwards, and we spend all our time doing these interesting things without love, and he's saying we should be prepping for heaven for what we're going to be doing, loving. And he says this in verse 13, these three remain, faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. And why is the greatest of these love? Well, you need faith in heaven. No, there's no need for faith in heaven. Well, you need hope in heaven. Of course not. Romans 8:24 tells us that hope is something where we hope in something we can't see. When we're in heaven, we will see. Well, we'll no longer need faith. We will no longer need hope. But will love remain? Yes, because it's the greatest of these things. Because it is what goes on forever. Eternity is coming. Prophecy, tongues, knowledge, all these things are going to pass away. Faith will no longer be needed. Hope will no longer be needed. Love will last forever. What do you think, Paul says, we ought to spend our time growing in? Love. Growing in love. This is how critically important Paul is saying. He's saying, listen, this is the most excellent way. In fact, he would say this, without love, everything else we're doing is a waste of time and energy. We can't do anything for God that matters without love for one another and love for God. We can't do this impossible task unless we come to the grips with the deep love Christ has for us because of the deep nature of our sin and disobedience. And we must understand that this is our future. This is the future we have, is a life of love of God and others for all of eternity. And we ought to figure this out now. Think of it this way. Once we get to heaven, you're not going to be able to use your spiritual gift of maybe teaching or service or all these things. None of it, there's no need for it. You will be serving and worshiping God, but it will be in the power and strength of our bodies and his strength there. It'll be a completely different thing. The only thing we're going to be doing there that we do here is love. The one thing we can do here that we can't do in heaven, stay with me on this, are you with me? The one thing we can do here that we can't do in heaven is love other sinners who are busted up. See, when we get to heaven, we're going to finally all be well-behaved, right? And you think, well, that sounds boring. It'll be fine. It'll be fun. But see, here is the time where we get to exercise love in the way that Christ did. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. See, this is the time where we get to offer love to others who don't deserve our love. We get to offer love to others who will reject it. We get to offer love to those who would step on it. We get to expend our love and have it wasted, have it fall on deaf ears. We can serve others who will reject us. We will receive criticism, complaint. See, all that we can do here. Once we're in heaven, the opportunity to serve God in that way is gone. This is the time where we get to love the way Christ loved. There's a couple of application points. We've covered a lot of ground and maybe tried to cover too much, but that's okay. I want you to think about this. If you're a Christian here this morning, you can think back and remember a time where you put your faith in Christ for salvation. I want you to think of 1 Corinthians 13. And take inventory of your own heart, knowing that one day we get to stand before Lord, and before Jesus, before God, and He's going to look at the work we have done in this life, and He's simply going to say, did we do that out of love? Out of love like Christ loved. Love for those who don't deserve it. Love to those who don't deserve our time, our effort, or who have rejected us or hurt us. And as a demonstration that I've received undeserved love for Christ, can I love and serve others? Can I take inventory of my own heart? Can you take inventory of your own heart and say, do I serve, do I do what I do as a Christian because I love God and because I love the people around me? The way Christ loves them, not just when they're nice and polite, but also when they can be a little bit gnarly and painful. The other thing I think we can be convicted of and be challenged by this chapter here this morning is having a greater awareness of what we've been saved from. The love of God that we have for others is an exact result of our understanding of how God has saved us from our own sin. And the fact is, if we have trouble loving others, if we have trouble loving God, it's because we haven't come to a true appreciation for the depth of our own rebellion. In fact, Jesus said, for those who said, I understand that I need forgiveness. I understand that I don't love the way I ought to. The Pharisee he was talking to about the Good Samaritan, he said to him, you're not far from the kingdom of God. This is the love of God. Cry out to God and understand, I need forgiveness. I need salvation. I need His restoration in my own heart. Jesus died for us on the cross, and He would not withhold His love for us, despite the fact that if we were there, we would have helped hang Him on it. And He still says, no, I love you. I'm going to die for you. I'm still going to pay the price for you and for your sin. We have the opportunity in looking at the own gaps in the love in our own heart and saying, you know what? I think I need to have a greater appreciation for the love of Christ and the sin in my own life. And appreciate and rest in His grace and mercy. How much we love others is a function of how much we've received the love of Christ. And if we haven't done much bad sin, we aren't going to love others very much. So my challenge for us as Christians here is to understand we need to love one another by receiving the love of Christ. And if you're here and you're not a believer, you can't think back to a time where you said, yeah, I need Jesus' forgiveness. I would appeal to you today, not just because you need it because of disobedience and rebellion. I mean, I think that goes without saying. If anyone can claim they are perfect, I don't know, I think I would call you on it. But I think one of the things we can discover here is that Jesus really loves us deeply. Is that He did everything He could possibly do to draw us into His kingdom. And now He's simply calling us to put our faith in Him for forgiveness of sins. And that's a tremendous offer He is saying. I love you, respond to me in faith, and I will give you forgiveness of sins. Will you join me in standing here for a moment as we close? I want to give us an opportunity to spend a little bit of time in prayer.